Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you guys here today as we continue this series called You'll Be Glad You Did. And we are a multi-site church here at Parker Hills, so let me give a big shout out to those of you joining us at our Clark Summit campus, my friends at our Wilkes-Barre campus, and a big welcome to those of you who may be watching this message online. And if you are watching online and you live within 30 miles of one of our locations, we'd love to have you join us in person next week to get the full experience. But great to have everyone here, no matter where here might be for you right now. And this series is called You'll Be Glad You Did. And the idea behind this series is that there are certain decisions we can make in one season of life that in a future season of life, we'll look back on those decisions and say, I'm glad I did. Or the flip side of that, there are certain decisions we can fail to make in one season of life that we will look back on someday and say, I wish I had. And the whole point of this series is to help us make the kinds of decisions that in the future will have us looking back and saying, I'm glad I did, a whole lot more than we say, I wish I had, so that we can live lives that reflect the glory of God and amplify our joy. So a little bit of review about where we've been. We've been talking about things you'll be glad you did throughout all different seasons of life. We talked about things you'll be glad you did as a young person, as a spouse, as a parent. And today I want to focus my comments primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on those who are in this season of life. If you're an empty nester or if you haven't never had kids and you're kind of over 55 in that season of life, that's who I'm going to be speaking today primarily, but not exclusively. So we made the font larger on the screens, and I'll talk a little bit louder and a little bit slower, okay? Because y'all are my tribe, okay? And like I said, I want to be very clear. What we're talking about today is relevant to all of us, no matter what stage of life we happen to be in. But the principles we're talking about today, I think, become even more relevant as we grow older. Now, if you're in this stage of life, I want to give you a warning right up front. I'm probably going to rattle your cage a little bit today. In fact, you may wish you had never heard this message, because today I'm going to challenge one of the most basic assumptions we have about what it means to live the American dream. Because the message we hear every day goes something like this: you need to work hard, you need to earn a lot of money, you need to invest well so that you can spend the last 20 or 30 years of your life living as comfortably as you possibly can. That's the American dream. Like, I did a little experiment this week. I went on Google and I did a Google search on this phrase, retirement lifestyle. And I did an image search. And I discovered that there are 3 images that come up most frequently when you search on this phrase. Probably the most common image is something with a beach in it, okay? Another really common image that comes up is golfing. And the third image that comes up quite frequently is 2 people sitting in very comfortable chairs. And many times there's a combination of the two, like sitting in comfortable chairs at the beach, okay? See, this is our image of the American dream. And the message we hear every day is this: that the goal in life is to get to retirement and then spend the rest of your life focusing on yourself. And as inviting as that looks, I want to suggest to you a better alternative. Now, I actually began thinking about this message last summer. Last July, my daughter Olivia and I spent a few days in the country of Haiti. And we went to Haiti to be part of an event that was organized by an organization called the Restavik Freedom Foundation. And now, Restavik is a form of child slavery that's been a part of Haitian culture literally for centuries. It is so common in Haiti that about 1 out of every 15 children are Restavik slaves. And so the Restavik Freedom Foundation has made it their goal to eradicate this form of child slavery. Now, it's a very fascinating fascinating story behind the founding of Restovic Freedom. It was founded by Joan Kahn. Joan and her husband Ray had a very, very successful construction business. And they got to a point in their 50s where the business was thriving. They had raised their kids. They had a lot of time on their hands. And so they started sailing. I mean, they loved to sail to tropical islands in the Caribbean. And so they're out on one of these sailing trips, and they had to stop in the country of Haiti to meet someone there, to pick someone up there. And they had never been in Haiti before. And so when they set foot in Haiti, they were absolutely blown away by the poverty and the chaos of that country. And it just so happens that they got lost in one of the major cities in Haiti as they were trying to connect with the person they were supposed to meet. Fortunately, they ran into a young Haitian man who could speak enough English that he helped them find the place where they were supposed to be and find the person they were supposed to meet up with. And so they got back on board their sailboat and they took off, but they kept in touch with that young Haitian man through email. Several years later, they went back to Haiti to reconnect with him and just to find out a little bit more about the country. And that's when they heard about this issue of Restovic, child slavery there in Haiti. And they began to research it. They began to talk to some of the victims of Restovic slavery. And they began to have this growing sense that God was prompting them to do something about it. And yet everybody they talked to about it tried to talk them out of it because everybody said that it was so ingrained in that culture that it would never, ever change. And so in 2006, Ray and Joan, they took a big step of faith. They bought a house in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and they took in 13 young women who had been Restovic slaves. They came out of just horrible, horrible home situations. 2006, that was 12 years ago. Today, the Restovic Freedom Foundation is working with over 900 Restovic kids. They have a staff of 30 people. They have a training program that is being held in 5,000 churches throughout the country. Their work has been featured on CNN and in the New York Times. I mean, they are literally changing the conscience of a nation. In fact, when my daughter and I were there last summer, we were talking with Joan, and she had to step away from the conversation because she had a telephone call. It was a phone call from the president of Haiti thanking her for the work that they're doing. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Ray and Joan are in their late 60s. In fact, Ray will turn 70 in a few months. They have the time and the resources to do anything they choose. And while many of their friends are playing golf and relaxing on a beach somewhere, they are leading an organization that is setting children free from slavery. So I called Joan this week, and I talked to her on the phone because I want to make sure I had all the details right. And at the end of our conversation, she said this. She said, "Haiti has given more to me than I've ever given to Haiti. My life has so much meaning and purpose. Sometimes I ask myself, what if I had said no to God's prompting?" And if I could condense that into 4 words, here's what she was saying. She was saying, "I'm glad I did." Now, please don't misunderstand me, and please don't misquote me, okay? I'm not against sailing. I'm not against playing golf. I'm not against beaches. I'm not against retirement. All of those are very good things. Here's the problem I have. I have a problem with this mindset in our culture that says for the last 20 or 30 years of your life, you should not be expected to do anything of eternal value. So, I want to draw your attention for the rest of our time today to the words of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 25, and again, the passage that we're looking at today, it really applies to all of us, no matter what stage of life that we're in. I'm going to make some specific connections to people in the stage of life that we're talking about this week, but really, this applies to all of us. And the words that we're going to look at here today in Matthew chapter 25, this is a parable that Jesus told, and he told many parables. And a parable was simply an everyday, down-to-earth story with a deeper spiritual meaning. And Jesus loved to tell these parables. In fact, about 1/3 of his words in the Bible are in these stories, these parables. And he would take the everyday things of his culture and weave them together and tell a story with a deeper spiritual meaning. And that's what this is. And here's how this parable, how this story begins. He says, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey, okay? So what Jesus is describing here, even though it sounds kind of strange to us, was not all that uncommon in that day. When a wealthy businessman was going to be gone for a period of time on a long journey, he would sometimes entrust his business affairs to people that he trusted. And so that's why it says he called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. And so there's this picture of a businessman who's going on a journey. He takes his business affairs and he turns them over to his servants. Now, in order to understand how this applies to us, in order to understand the spiritual meaning behind this, what we have to know is we have to know how each of the different elements in the story connects and what they're intended to represent. So the kingdom of heaven, he says, will be like a man. And so when Jesus speaks about a man in this parable, he's actually speaking about himself. He puts himself into this story. The servants in this story would be all followers of Christ. So that would be me and that would be you. If you would describe yourself as a Christian, you've given your heart to Christ. This journey that's described here in the story is the time between now and the future return of Christ. And the wealth that he talks about in this parable, that simply refers to the resources that every single one of us have been given. And so the point in the parable, as you're about to see as we unpack this, is that we as servants of Christ, we've been blessed with certain resources. Our money, our time, our experiences, our education, our skills, all of that stuff. We get to manage that for a period of time, and eventually we're going to give an account to the master, the one who entrusted it to us, okay? So I'll give you one word to summarize the meaning of this story that Jesus tells. It's the word stewardship. Now, if you grew up in church, you might have heard that word. Usually it's connected to a fundraising, campaign or something like that having to do with money. But stewardship really has a much broader meaning. It simply means this: the management of someone else's resources. Okay, so a steward is somebody who manages stuff for someone else who actually owns it. Like in the old days of the airline industry, before they were called flight attendants, they were called stewards and stewardesses, because it was their responsibility to manage the passengers and the food, and the peanuts and all that. They didn't own the plane, they didn't own the airline, but for this brief period of time called a flight, it was their job as stewards and stewardesses to manage what someone else owned. And so that's what stewardship really means. And so God says to us, those of us who are his, he says, here's some stuff, here's some brain power, here's some talent, here's some money. Manage it well, and someday when I return, I'll ask you how you did with that, okay? So that's the point of this parable. We're going to unpack that parable a little bit more in just a few minutes, but for now, I want you to think about your own life. And I want you to think about your life this way. I want you to think about your life as a treasure chest. Okay? Because Jesus tells this parable. It's a parable about bags of gold. It's about wealth. And so I want you to think about your life, about the treasure that is uniquely your life. Because as we go through life, we all collect treasure in different forms. And here's the cool thing. The older you get, the more treasure you have. And I'm not just talking about money, because for some of you that didn't really work out so well. Okay? But let me give you some examples of the treasure that you kind of collect through life. Here's one example: education, okay? So some of you have, over the years, have spent money. You've acquired a lot of education. In some cases, it might be formal education, some letters behind your name. For others of you, it's just been specific training that's helped you to learn certain information or knowledge. And sometimes you don't realize how much education you have until you talk to somebody else in your field who's just starting out, and you realize, wow, I've really, over the years, gained a real treasure of information. Here's another example, what I would call skills. So maybe over your lifetime, over a few decades, you've learned a trade, you pursued a hobby, and there's some area of your life where you've developed some expertise, where you're pretty good at something. Give you another example of this treasure, leadership. Maybe you've had some leadership opportunities and you've developed your leadership skill. You've had the opportunity to learn what it looks like to be part of a team and to relate to people and to cast a vision for people. And that leadership skill that you've developed over time, that's a treasure. Let's talk about the obvious one, money. Money, because over time, all of us make a certain amount of money, and if you work hard, and if God blesses you, and if you manage it well, you may get to the point in your life where you have a little bit more financial margin than you used to have. You have a little bit more of that tangible treasure. One that's similar to that would be possessions. You know, you may eventually get to the point where you pay off your mortgage, and you own your house, and you have a few cars, or maybe you have a collection of tools or a collection of something else, or maybe if you're really, really fortunate, you have a second house. But for some of you, that's a part of the treasure in your treasure box in your life is possessions. Perhaps the most important one is faith. You know, some of you have spent years growing your faith and you've developed a deep understanding of the Bible and you have a theology that's deeply rooted. That's a treasure. For some of you, you went through a season where you struggled with your faith, where you had a lot of doubt, but you wrestled with that doubt and you came out the other side. And so one of the greatest treasures you have is a faith that's been tested. And so when you meet other people who are wrestling and struggling with their doubt, you are uniquely qualified to help them through that. Let me talk about a couple of things that you may not perceive as treasure in your life, like loss. Maybe you've been through some kind of tragedy or some kind of deep disappointment, and you walked through this season of your life that was just a dark, dark valley, but then you came out the other side of that, and you've got the credibility because you've been through loss. You've got the credibility to walk with other people who are going through some kind of heartbreak. So in that sense, God has given you a treasure. Or think about this one, failure. I think most of the time we learn more from failure than we do from our success. Maybe that's a marriage failure for you. Maybe it's a business failure. Maybe it's something you're afraid to talk about. But that may be your greatest treasure because it may be through your own experience of failure that you're able to help somebody else who's experiencing a failure and thinks that is like the end for them. And then on top of all of these things, one of the greatest treasures we get as we grow older typically is we get more time because, you know, we raise our kids, they're out of the house, our career gets more established, and if you get to the point where you actually can retire from your career, you've got, you know, a lot of time. So here's my question. What are you going to do with this? What are you going to do with this treasure? Because if you're at a stage of life, you know, where your kids are grown and, you know, things have gone well for you and you've accumulated some things over a period of time, you can actually do some good. See, you don't have to sit on the sidelines for the last 20 or 30 years of your life. In fact, if you do, you know what you're doing? You're wasting this. So what are you going to do with the treasure? Like here's the bottom line. Here's the bottom line of the whole message. The value of your life will be measured by what you give, not by what you have. The value of your life, when it's all said and done, and other people and God himself look back and survey your life, the value of your life will not be measured by what you have, but by what you give. And see, this is the opposite of the message we hear every single day in our culture, because the message we hear every day is that the value of your life is measured by what you pile up, by what you have, by how comfortable the lifestyle is that you can create for yourself. But God says, no, the value of your life will be measured by what you do with the treasure that I've entrusted to you, how you invest that, what you give, not by what you have. Okay? So, having said all that, let me jump back in now to Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus is telling this parable. And I want to tell you 4 principles about this treasure that God has blessed you with, no matter who you are. Number 1 is this, that God is the giver of this treasure. Jesus begins the parable this way. He says, the kingdom of heaven will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted, what does it say here? His wealth to them. So whatever we have in this life, we only have it because God gave it to us to begin with. He is the ultimate source of everything that we have. Every dollar of your finances, every breath in your lungs, every moment of time and every day, all of it is only because of God's grace. And here's why we need to remember that. We need to remember that because when life goes really well for us, and when we're feeling some of what this world calls success, and when life is pretty comfortable, we begin to think that it's because of our hard work and our wise decisions that we've gotten to that place. And those things are important. Certainly that's a part of the equation, hard work and good decisions. But ultimately, the biggest factors in the blessings that we enjoy in our lives are beyond our control. Like, none of us get to decide what country we were born in. You know, you couldn't choose your parents. You didn't get to decide what your IQ was going to be. You didn't get to decide whether you're going to have good physical health or illness. You know, we didn't choose the opportunities that came across our paths. And so ultimately, if we can trace it all back, we have to recognize that whatever treasure we have in our lives, that ultimately we have to trace it back to God's goodness to us, His grace to us. And see, when you understand that everything in your life comes from God to begin with, the only logical thing you can do is to use whatever you've been given in a way that will honor the one who gave it to you in the first place. And so God is the giver of this treasure. That's where we have to start. Then the second principle that you see here is this. Not only is God the giver of this treasure, but God does not give everyone the same treasure. Because it goes on to say this in verse 15. It says, to one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. See, your treasure is going to be different from someone else's treasure because God never gives his servants all the same treasure. God has given you a unique blend of opportunities and education and skills and life experiences and failures and losses, and all of that makes the treasure that is you unique. And every one of the servants in this story had some kind of treasure. One had 5 bags of gold, one had 2 bags of gold, one had 1 bag of gold. What you'll notice is that there isn't a servant in the story that had 0 bags of gold, because every single one of us has something in this treasure chest that God has given to us. And here's our temptation. Our temptation is to compare and either be prideful or be jealous. Like if you perceive yourself as a 1 bag of gold person, you look at the 5 bag of gold person and you say, well, you know, I wish I had what they have, or if I had what they have, I'd certainly use it differently than they're using it. And here's what you got to understand. It doesn't matter what treasure you've been given. It just matters how you manage it. That's what matters. And here's what you have to understand. That 5 bag of gold person, I wouldn't want to be that person, because that just means you're accountable for a whole lot more. So number one, God is the giver of this treasure. Number 2, God does not give everyone the same treasure. And then number 3 is this, the third treasure principle in this parable that Jesus is telling is this, that we decide what to do with this treasure. That we are the managers, we are the stewards for a period of time. We have control over what we're going to do with all the treasure that God has put into our lives. Here's how the story continues, verse 16. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. He doubled it. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. He doubled it. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now, many Bible scholars say that when Jesus told the story this way, he was implying that the man buried the money because he didn't want anyone to know that he had been given this money. He didn't want there to be any record, any paper trail, because that way, if the master for some reason never did return, there'd be no record of him being given the money, and no one would be the wiser, and he would just keep it for himself, so it may simply be an act of deception. But the point here is this. Just like the servants in the story, every single one of us has some kind of treasure that we get to choose how we're going to manage it. And you may have a little or you may have a lot, but ultimately that's not what really matters in the eyes of God. What matters is how well you manage whatever you have. This treasure called your life, you can manage it well, you can invest it well, or you can dig a hole in the ground and you can bury it. And so the final principle is this, and perhaps the most important principle, that we will give an account for how we use this treasure. God gave it to us. He doesn't give everyone the same treasure. We decide what to do with this treasure, and then ultimately we give an account for how we use it. Now, during my last year in college, a couple of friends and I, we had a great opportunity. It was like the coolest opportunity. We were contacted by this older couple, and they were planning to head out to California, and they were going to spend 8 months in California with their only daughter and their grandchildren. And so instead of leaving their house empty, they decided that they wanted someone to live in their house while they were gone and take care of the house and take care of the property, just watch over things. So we met them, we talked a little while, kind of interviewed, and then we were allowed for 8 months to live free of charge in this house. And it was nice. It was a 3-bedroom house, 2-car garage, couple acres of land. There was a tractor and a garden. I mean, we were living large and we were living free, and it was great. And the only condition was this: we had to take care of it. We had to manage the house well. We had to take care of the house well, take care of the property. And there were 2 cats and 47, I'm not making this up, 47 houseplants. Okay? And so we knew, we're living in this place, we're living large, we're loving this place, but all the while, in the back of our minds, we knew this was not really ours, and eventually we were going to have to give an account for how we managed this place that we had the privilege of using. Now, let me tell you how the story turns out. It didn't turn out to be 8 months, because after being in California for 4 months, the husband passed away very suddenly of a heart attack. He was a great guy and just had a massive heart attack, and he passed away. And so we get a phone call one day from his wife, and she says, gave his name, said, Judd passed away. And, we were heartbroken with her, but then she said, I'm sorry, I've decided I just need to come home early. And we're like, sure, we understand completely. I'll be there in 2 days. Okay. We had not been good stewards, okay? We were not prepared to give an accounting of our management. It was panic. We did not sleep for 48 hours. I'm not making that up. We didn't sleep. And eventually it came out okay that, the house was fine, the cat survived. We only lost about 10 plants. But all of us are living that reality. Like, God has given us certain things to enjoy for a period of time, and ultimately there will be an accounting for what He has given to us. Listen to how the rest of the parable goes. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Now keep this in mind. You're going to hear this again, word for word. You entrusted me, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. So that's the first servant. Goes on to say this, the man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. His master replied, same exact words, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Interesting observation here. The first servant, his net gain was 5 bags of gold. Second servant, his net gain was 2 bags of gold. Big difference in the net gain, but that wasn't the point. They were equally faithful no matter how much they had. It doesn't matter how much you have. It matters what you do with what you have. He says, come and share your master's happiness. And then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you were a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. It's so interesting, his response. Do you hear what he's doing? He's actually blaming the master. And what he says makes no sense. He says, I knew that you would expect me to invest it well and that you would expect something from me. Therefore, knowing that you would expect something, I did nothing. It makes absolutely no sense. And notice something here. He didn't steal his master's money. He didn't give him back a suitcase full of IOUs. He didn't go out and blow it on drugs or prostitution. He gave back exactly what he had been given. And listen to the response, verse 26. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I return, I would have received it back with interest. Do you hear the words he uses here? Wicked, lazy servant. The guy didn't steal anything, didn't defraud the owner. He didn't do anything bad. The problem is he just did nothing. He wasted a tremendous opportunity. He didn't use the treasure that he had been given. So at the end of the story here, there's 3 servants, okay? The first 2 servants look back and they say, I'm glad I did. The third servant looks back and he says, I wish I had. And here's the question that this parable begs to ask. And the question is this: what will you do with the treasure you've been given? Because listen, when you get to be 70-something or 80-something and you look back over your life, the thing you will value the most at that point, the thing you will value the most is the way that you have shaped the hearts of people and the ways that you have invested in people. When you get to that point and you look back, it's not going to matter how much money you had, how much golf you played, how many cool trips you went on. None of that's really going to matter all that much, because when you get to the very end of your life, here's what would become crystal clear to you: that the value of your life will be measured by what you give, not what you have. So what are you going to do with all this? Especially if you're in the stage of life that we're talking about. I mean, you can leverage the treasure that you've accumulated over a lifetime of experience and education and skill and wise management and all of that, and you can invest it and you can do some really good things. You can invest in the next generation. You can make a big difference. And here's the thing: if you take some of this treasure and you invest it in the right way, eventually you're going to look back and you're going to say, I'm glad I did, instead of saying, I wish I had. A few years ago, I read a great book by John Piper. It's called Don't Waste Your Life. And there was a story in this book that always stuck with me. It's a powerful quote. Let me just read it for you. Here's what he writes. He says, I will show you how to waste your life. Consider a story from Reader's Digest, which tells about a couple who took early retirement from their jobs in the Northeast 5 years ago, when he was 59 and she was 51. Now they live in Punta Gorda, Florida, where they cruise on their 30-foot trawler, play softball, and collect shells. At first, when I read about it, I thought it might be a joke, but it wasn't. Tragically, this is the American dream. Come to the end of your life, your one and only precious God-given life, and let the last great work of your life, before you give an account to your Creator, be this: playing softball and collecting shells. Picture them before Christ at the great day of judgment. Look, Lord, see my shells? That is a tragedy. And people today are spending billions of dollars to persuade you to embrace that tragic dream. Don't buy it. Don't waste your life. I want to give you a flesh and blood example of what we've been talking about today. I want to let you hear the story of Dave and Cindy Morrison. Dave and Cindy attend our Clark Summit campus, and I'll tell you what, they are such an inspiration to me because they have been living out the principles that we've been talking about today. They came to a point in their lives where, God had been good to them, and they had the time and money to just coast for the last 20 or 30 years of their lives. But they decided to take the treasure they had been given and use it to bless others. And I'll tell you what, there's just so much to their story. We couldn't fit it all in to one video for time's sake. In fact, Dave, you'll hear him reference the fact that in his retirement, he's been flipping houses. And one of the reasons he does that is not to do it for the profit, but one of the reasons he does that is to bless others, because they make it a habit to flip these houses and sell them below market value intentionally to people who are struggling and just trying to get into their first home. And he makes it a point to hire people who have a criminal background and can't get that first job, and he works closely beside them, and he disciples them and helps them to reestablish a good work record. In one of the homes they kept, and they rent out the apartments very cheaply to people who are coming out of drug addiction programs because they need a place to live or they can't be released from the program. I mean, these guys are just doing some amazing things in a season of life when many people would just be coasting. So I want you to hear part of their story. So watch this with me.
I own my own business. I was a business form distributor, and I did that for over 20-some years.
I taught Spanish for several years, and then I got into IT for 30 years and retired and couldn't stay retired, so I started volunteer teaching.
Well, neither one of us could stay retired. That's why I started flipping houses as a hobby, thinking I'd do 1 or 2 a year, but it's been 12 years, and I've done about 54 of them now. When we actually retired, we said, we'll work on the travel. That's one thing we never did because
we never could afford to.
Yeah, we never could afford to. So when we first started travel, we traveled mainly to Central America. Each year we tried to stay a little bit longer, and we got up to where we stayed maybe 6 or 7 weeks. And then finally we bought a place in Nicaragua, in San Juan del Sur, it's on the Pacific coast. That's sort of when our plans changed.
We found ourselves raising our grandson Isaac. At first it was really difficult because we thought we would miss the travel, but to have the opportunity to raise such a kind and loving and respectful young man and to be a part of his life, it's much more rewarding than the travel was.
Last year my mom passed away. I just didn't want to see my dad up there all by himself all day long. So we took my office that I had when I had my business in the basement, and we turned it into a bedroom, and the rec room we turned into his living room. It's just the fact that we can all sit down as a family, both with Isaac and him. It's much better for him. At least he has some enjoyable chaos in his life. with a 2-year-old granddaughter running around, which we have 6 days a week. We have one at every level in life. We have a 2-year-old, we have a 15-year-old, and we have an 89-year-old. So it's made us enjoy life.
There are definitely times when we say, this is overwhelming and maybe we'd like to be back in Roatan or somewhere. But watching Isaac grow up, seeing the crazy little lady that Harper is, it's just so rewarding.
We get more enjoyment and feel better about ourselves being able to know that we're helping Harper, we're helping Isaac, we're helping my dad.
I think they've blessed us far more than we could, do for them. They really have. I mean,
you look around at what we have, and we've been truly blessed. And we know it. And so we want to give back. We want to help others.
I think for me too, the reason that I'm so glad that we're doing it is when we raised our kids, we believed in Christ, but we practiced a very legalistic faith. We didn't have a personal relationship with Christ at the time. And so we didn't have the opportunity to share that with them, to share that relationship and that closeness. So to be able to have Isaac living with us and, helping raise him, hopefully we can do a better job than we did with our own children.
I would say if you're getting ready for retirement and want to go to the beach and hang out, you can only read so many books, maybe only drink so many pina coladas. You get more enjoyment out of retirement and life by just doing things for others. I mean, you can do a lot more than
And you think you can.
you think you can do. Exactly.